federal, state, and local emergencies pursuant to Minnesota statutes, Chapter 12, and other laws. Further attendance of the meeting by any member of the city council, city staff, or the public at the regular meeting location in the city council chambers is not feasible due to COVID-19 pandemic and the closure of City Hall to members of the public. As a result of the foreseeing, the special city council meeting will be conducted safely by telephone or other electronic means as provided in Minnesota statutes 13D.021, and no one in person will be conducted in the city council chambers. I think it is important to recognize that using a video conference is not as good as in-person meeting, but it is necessary. Under these circumstances, we are doing the best that we can to maintain transparency and due process. I would appreciate everyone's patience and cooperation as we work through the meeting. Please stand for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge of allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. Okay, seeing that this meeting is being held remotely, when I call your name, please indicate your presence. Councilmember Balsonic.
Here.
Councilmember Brox.
Here.
Councilmember Fulch.
Here.
Councilmember Leifeld.
Here.
Councilmember Lund.
Here.
Councilmember Vaughn.
Here.
Let the roll reflect that all council members are present and a quorum has been established. Tonight, we have with us a presentation for the Emerald Ash Borer, and we welcome Jeff Hafner from Rainbow Tree Care. Welcome, Jeff.
Hi.
Hello.
Do I just jump right in? Is that it? Do I go? Wow.
Yeah.
I'm ready.
Okay.
Thank you, Mayor and Council, for inviting me back. It's always a thrill to be talking about trees, whether in person or not. So I shared a PDF with Dan today, which I can see in front of me. How is it? Do I just ask to advance the slide? Is that how it works? Do I make a film strip beep sound? Yes. Perfect. So some of this will be review, and I'm happy to just answer questions as they come up. If anything inspires you to ask a question, no need to wait for the end. But I've been in front of you all before and talked about how I help cities with their public trees, combining the insights from national research on EAB management and looking for practical implementation strategies. I also work to develop comprehensive plans, which include economic models to develop municipal budgets, and then creating and implementing the municipal and homeowner programs, which is typically what I visit you to talk about. So if we could click to the next slide, please. That middle bullet that is really the source of the conversation tonight. So the comprehensive plans that I develop for cities include a budget model that predict future costs relative to the actions that a city takes or the mix of actions. So the next slide, please. With this budget model, it's very large and it typically goes with a 30 or 40 page plan. So in order to help communities work their way in that direction, we created a simplified version, which just takes like the two edges. So it really compares two theoretical scenarios. One in which ash trees are just left unprotected and removed and replaced as they die. So we call that the base case. So that is what a community would use if they had no plan and took no action, but were able to keep up with their annual dead tree removal. And we compare that to what we call the recommended plan. And I'll hopefully get you to the point where you can see why it is the recommended plan as far as I'm concerned. The plan looks at the high quality ash trees being protected during really two phases, an aggressive phase early in the infestation and a maintenance phase later on as all the unprotected ash trees are killed. So we can go to the next slide. So at the request of staff, I used this simplified model and plugged in the city's boulevard tree data. And I'm just showing what the simplified model spits out. We can go through piece by piece as we move along and zoom in, but I hope that you've all had a chance to see this and have looked at it. But before I dive too deeply into this, I do want to review a little bit of what has happened so far through that private EAB management plan that I've worked with the city to protect trees at discounted rates over the last few years. So we could go to the next slide, please. Oh, yes. Also, what's very important to keep in mind is that trees have benefits that are quantifiable. So in that simplified model, you'll start to see some cost projections, but also some benefit projections. So if you remember during my visit in February, I talked about how an average or a 19-inch ash tree provides $173 worth of benefits every year, and you can see the breakout and where those benefits are realized. Next slide, please. And if you remember, I shared the numbers on private tree participation over the last 3 years, 17, 18, and 19. And there are those dots on the map, each dot representing an individual tree. So far, through these years, 17, 18, and 19, we've been protecting trees with homeowners and not necessarily noting whether they were technically on the private side of that right-of-way line or growing in the public right-of-way, because the city allows for residents to protect those public ash trees. Some of these tree counts are likely on the right-of-way. And so after this conversation, if there are further actions that lead us to determining more precisely where those trees grow, that is something that is relatively easy for us to do. We can go to the next slide. So then I reported using just the 2-year combined totals of 18 and 19, the total of 868 trees are being protected in Hastings by residents. And then you can see the total inches of trunk diameter and then that cumulative annual benefit from those trees. Now the 2020 trees are currently being protected, so I didn't pull any numbers because it's still too early to really predict where that program is headed. Was kind of the recap that I wanted to hopefully refresh everybody's memory that participation is great on the private side, that these trees are providing a lot of benefits, and that that by keeping these trees alive, we've deferred removal costs. Next slide, please. No questions so far? Everybody's so quiet. So I'll return to the model, and I put a red rectangle around where the model really starts, and that is with that tree data. So those are the variables that I work with city staff typically to develop a mix of actions. And again, this simplified model is really trying to compare the two edges of all trees being killed versus all trees being protected. We can go to the next slide and we'll zoom in a little bit on that red rectangle. So those first few lines, the number of ash trees and the DBH, or the diameter at breast height, the inches measured across the trunk, those are from the city's inventory. About 1,030 trees were counted in the city's right-of-way, and they, working with Chris, we estimated their average is approximately 19 inches. So right at that, average $173 in annual benefits. And then just using estimates for discussion purposes, we look at what a replacement tree size might be, about 1.5 inches. That's going to help the model predict what replacement tree benefits would be, because it's going to then calculate those smaller trees going in place of where those larger trees were removed. And the removal costs per diameter inch, again, that's working with staff to see what city costs currently are, and then what new tree costs are. And then part of that cost data is also going to look at what the treatment costs would be per diameter inch. And that is assuming it's done with city staff. So staff time, products, and materials for staff to inject those trees. Then the actions are really a mix. So we would say in this scenario, 100% of the mature trees that get removed get replaced. And we would estimate that 75% of those 1,000 trees are worthy of protection. So there's likely some of those trees that maybe aren't in the best spot or aren't in the best condition. So again, just using that idea for discussion purposes, we're saying 75%. And then the treatment frequency during that aggressive phase that I mentioned, we're assuming 1/3 of the total trees are getting treated every year, so that number is essentially the same every year on a 3-year rotation. You can go to the next slide if there's no questions there. So then the model spits out these two comparisons. I mentioned the base case is just assuming that trees die in what we call the EAB death curve. So they die slowly at first, and then as the insect population builds, trees die quicker. They're estimated to be killed in 10 years. Now that is just a model parameter that's built in, because that was what many of the communities first hit with EAB experienced. If they were able to take no action, the trees were typically dead in about 10 years. Now we found since then, each action that a community takes will help extend the length of time that it takes for all those ash trees to die. But because this is a simplified model just used to compare those two edges of management, it's just predicting that the trees are dead in 10 years. And then you can see the total costs. They're broken out by tree removal, tree replacement. Now, in the base case, there are no treatment costs because there is no treatment taking place. And it also predicts the cumulative value of those replaced trees in the base case or in the preserved mature trees in the recommended plan. And then if you click one more, it'll highlight a couple areas. The top table is really just looking at years 1 through 10. And you can see that base case total cost is 1.1 million. Now that model assumes that within 10 years, all those trees are dead. So there are no additional base case costs to speak of in that next table, years 1 through 20. But currently in Hastings, those removal and replacement costs in the right-of-way are assumed to be split, 40% being covered by the city and 60% covered by the adjacent property owner. No questions so far? Man, nailing it. So the next slide then. This isn't typically included in that one-page PDF just because it's harder to format, but I took the time to format it here so that you can see that is the base case sum of 1.1 million broken out in those annual years. And what you'll see is a spike in those years 4, 5, and 6 into 7, because that is the peak of when we would anticipate ash trees dying. That's when the pest population has really reached that peak point and trees are really under heavy attack. So then you can see that breakout, that 40-60 breakout annually, and what those costs would be for each payer group. Go to the next slide. So what I want to highlight here is that in years 1 through 10, that recommended plan is 51% of costs, 89% more tree value, because tree protection is less expensive and because it preserves those mature tree benefits. What is unique to Hastings in this scenario, though, is that we'll split those treatment costs to be assumed between the city and the homeowner. So while those base case costs are split 40-60, these recommended plan costs, no current split discussed, at least as far as I know, or at least as far as the model is concerned. So then one more click. Mentioned those base case costs are essentially spent by the end of year 10. So there isn't really a growth of costs for years 11 through 20, whereas the recommended plan still does have costs because there is still tree protection taking place. So that cost savings is reduced. Now you've only saved 31% because those trees continue to grow and continue to provide annual benefit that far exceed the replacement costs. You can see that by saving 31% in dollars, you've actually accumulated 172% more in that. Next slide. I threw in, this is a zoomed in a couple line, or one line chart that looks at those cumulative costs so that you can see that base case, as I mentioned, is really, you're done spending by year 10. Even after 20 years, the model predicts not having spent as much on protecting those high quality mature trees. And if you think back to the cost numbers that we put in, so much cost is wrapped up in replacement tree, and those replacement trees don't provide a lot of benefit. So it makes sense that this is what the model would predict, that you would spend more and have less tree value. So we can go to the next slide. And I just tried to sum it up really quick, 2 bullets. The recommended plan, as I mentioned, hopefully I could get you to the point where you can see why I recommend it, because I am a fan of trees and because it does spend less money, both lower annual costs, which can be important, especially in those peak years of 4 through 6, 4 through 7. So lower total costs even after 20 years. But it's the theoretical model, and it's comparing the 2 edges of that scenario, as I mentioned. So what I have found in all the communities that I work with is that the actual results really fall somewhere in between, because it's unlikely that you could protect all of those right-of-way trees. Some of them will have to be removed. And as you take more and more action by protecting those trees, you slow the rate that untreated trees die. So you don't see all of those trees being removed in 10 years. Really just a theoretical comparison. But the results, I think, are stark enough to at least help people, start seeing the advantages of tree protection. Last slide is just the thanks, and I'm happy to answer questions.
Jeff, council, any questions for Councilmember Balsonic?
Thank you, Your Honor. Okay, I want to go back to that 40-60 split. That's for boulevard trees. Is that correct?
My understanding, yes. Sorry, Chris, go ahead.
Yeah, council member, I'll jump in here as needed. That is correct. 40-60 for cost of removal of the tree if it is a boulevard tree, if it has been maintained and protected, if there's proof of that, and that does not include removal of stump or replant.
Okay, then if a homeowner treats a tree that's on the boulevard, is there still a 40-60 split on the cost of the treatment?
No, sir, there's no there's no splitting of the cost for treatment. The way our ordinances are written, it is the responsibility of the property owner to maintain boulevard trees, which includes preventative maintenance, whether it's an ash tree, an oak tree, an elm tree, what have you. It is the property owner's responsibility to maintain.
So the ordinance deals with trimming, pruning, and in this case, treatment, if it is an ash tree. Okay, thank you.
Councilmember Fulch.
Your Honor. So what's really interesting is that when you look at Mr. Hafner's data where he showed the pin map where treatments are occurring, as a for instance, in Ward 1 from the downtown until about like 10th Street, there are a lot. You know, Chris Jenkins has another map. He has another pin map that shows the location of all of the ash trees that are within the boulevard. And what's super interesting is to overlay the two, because then you'll see that, like for instance, between the downtown and 10th Street on the east side of Highway 61, there's barely any trees that are being treated, but the boulevards are full of ash trees. They're just, and if you walk those streets, you'll just see, I mean, like you'll see properties with 4 or 5 ash trees that, you know, the corner lots that just have them lying down the street. And so people aren't treating them. And so what's going to happen is that we're already in year 3 that Hastings has begun to have EAB spread, and we're currently considered completely infested. And so when you look at the death curve that Mr. Hafner has pointed out here, it's like we're getting close to where we're going to really start to hit the bell curve within our community. And so then the conversation becomes, when these trees begin to die, and Mr. Hafner can talk about this a little bit more about what happens to the trees when they do begin to die, because they become extremely brittle due to how the larvae crisscross underneath the bark, and the trees start to kind of, like the limbs and everything just starts to fall off of them, and they become a public safety hazard. And so he could speak to like what Michigan has seen as an experience. And so what happens is that it's not the homeowners that get stuck with the removal, it's the cities that have to go in and start taking down these trees because they start to die in mass quantities. And so I think that's really, I mean, honestly, that's what we're beginning to have to like look at and have realistic expectations for, you know, what's really going to happen if people aren't treating those trees. And we're saying, well, it's your problem, you know, resident, you know, that if you treat it, great, we'll do the 40-60 split. But if they're treating the tree isn't going to die. The tree's going to die if it's not being treated. And so then the tree dies, and it's the responsibility of the homeowner to have to remove it quickly. And so, so this is why the last few years I've been saying, hey, I think that we should be proactively managing the tree inventory within the boulevards when we go and we do road construction projects, so that we could start to look at, okay, well, do we start to remove some of these trees to get ahead of the bell curve so that we're not dealing with a huge mass death of all the trees within our city. And so, so I just throw that out there because I think that we just have to start being realists as to what has the experience been in other states and other communities, and how other cities are trying, you know, to tackle this with both, you know, a suggested treatment plan, you know, for the boulevard trees, but then also more of an active tree management plan, going in there and removing them and putting in new trees, you know, when it's most cost effective. And so, so that was one of the other reasons I wanted to have this conversation, so that we're all on the same page, that we're moving towards, we're on this bell curve now, and it's going to become a reality in the next 4 years. And so like, how are we going to deal with it? And so I just think we have to start having those honest conversations. So, and Mr. Hafner, if you want to jump in and say anything about the comments that I just said, so it's just not me saying it. I just think that it would be helpful for some of that kind of experience to be, shared in realistically what does start to happen when those trees die.
Yeah, sure. As you mentioned, they do become very brittle, and when they are completely dead, they can fall apart under wind loads or no wind loads. And when they're growing in public spaces over where people move around, it is definitely a safety concern.
Okay, Councilmember Balsanic.
Yes, the reason I asked about the 40-60 split is that it just seems to me it's cheaper for the city to enter into an agreement with property owners taking care of ash trees on the boulevard if we to amend our ordinance or add something to it or come up with a new ordinance that would get the city involved and be more proactive with the preventative maintenance. I mean, the cost of taking a tree down, a mature one, I think about the one that's in our front yard, which has about a 28, I think it's a 28-inch. Mr. Hafner, you don't measure you're saying across, so that's the diameter.
That's correct, yes.
Okay. The cost of taking that tree down is going to be in the range of about $3,000 or so dollars. The city's going to assume 40% of that cost. It just seems to me that we would be better off if the city would be proactive and start to get involved in treatment of these trees. Because as Councilmember Fulch points out, very, with a great deal of articulation, is that in 3-4 years, we're going to be stuck with a huge amount of money that we're going to have to spend to get rid of these dead trees. Whereas, looking at all of the charts and graphs and everything that you had presented earlier to us here tonight, it would be much more logical to do the preventative maintenance, a heck of a lot cheaper than in 4 years having to come around and say, well, we're going to have to spend about $100,000 to get rid of these trees. Wouldn't it, Mr. Hafner, wouldn't it be, I mean, it seems pretty simple to me. It just seems to me that preventative maintenance is really the way to go for the city rather than to sit around and wait for the trees to die, like Councilmember Fulch pointed out, and then be stuck with a huge, huge bill.
Yeah, council member, I believe that trees, when considered part of the city's infrastructure, fall right in line with other elements to which we apply preventative maintenance measures to all the time. We typically don't wait for any piece of public infrastructure to reach the point where it's just unusable and then replace it. So setting aside the fact that they are trees and they are dear to me, I do believe that, yes, preventative maintenance is a wise approach for public trees.
Mayor, if I can address council a bit here, just to put a few of the specifics into context and air those out a little bit. I've pointed out a little bit earlier that since 2017, the city has been negotiating the best possible price for residents to take advantage of because it is the homeowner's responsibility to maintain boulevard trees. The staff have carried out the approved plan by council, and understanding now that we are at a point where it's probably time to take a look at that and see if that's the way that we want to continue. But at this point, it remains the responsibility of the property owner to prune, care for, maintain, or treat any tree that's in the boulevard within their property boundaries, whether it is an ash tree, an oak tree, an elm tree, etc. Another policy that plays into this is the diseased and hazardous tree. And as a part of this, the current plan that we're in, 4 years ago now, maybe, council reaffirmed that the property owner does not properly care for or provide preventative maintenance for a boulevard tree, the 60-40 cost share does not apply. The full cost of removal, stump removal, and replanting is then borne by the property owner. Probably a few other intricacies of it, and if council has questions, happy to answer those, but want to clear up a few things here. And the city does not currently cost share for treatment. We negotiate very good pricing for residents to take advantage of. And just to note, the 1,030 ash trees that are in the boulevard consist of about 22 to 24% of the total boulevard trees that are in Hastings. So it's a pretty good percentage of that, but it also shows that Hastings has done a good job with tree diversity. Boulevards, we're not 50% ash, 50% oak. We've got a good mix that's out there. So no conclusions, just sharing information.
Thank you, Chris. Any other questions, council? Okay, thank you, Jeff, for your presentation.
Pleasure. Thank you for
Yes.
having me.
You're welcome. And thanks, Chris, for your assistance too.
Mayor?
Yes, Councilmember Fulch.
Thank you, Your Honor. And so this was just a presentation, so that folks are all kind of up to speed as to what the current state of affairs is. And so I think I'm alarmed, just to be quite frank, that we're going to lose a quarter of our ash trees and a quarter of our tree canopy flat out within our community in the next, because like I said, we're already in year 3 on the bell curve. And so we don't have really any plan on how to deal with this, because yeah, it is a good price. And thank you, Parks and Rec staff, for negotiating with Rainbow Tree Care, and Rainbow, thank you for being a great partner with municipalities. But the fact of the matter is, the majority of people aren't treating their trees. As I had just said, that if you look in various areas of the community, some areas have a higher density of those than others. As I said, as a for instance, like in Ward 1 between the downtown and 10th Street, and those are all much older homes. And so they have lower property values. And a lot of the people then who are living in them have, not everyone, but I would bet that there's a lower socioeconomic income in those areas than, like as for instance, around like the Walden Park area up in Ward 4, right? But that's where people are treating their trees, are, in the higher value housing areas. And so I think that we have to be realistic about what's going to happen, and that these people can't afford to treat the trees. Like for instance, I have one of these trees and it costs $350 to treat my tree. And it's a really big one, but it kills me to have to treat it every couple of years. And I'm doing it only because to remove it, I know is going to cost me $2,000 to $3,000. And so I just think that we need more of a succinct conversation, offline in a workshop or something, where we are really talking more frankly about how can we be more proactive in addressing this rather than just wishing that residents would have enough money to be able to treat these trees on their own. Because like I said, I got a feeling we're going to get stuck with holding the bag when all these trees really start to die off and individual residents can't, you know, afford to take down the trees, even, you know, what if they have a few of the trees? Like I said, it's not uncommon for in some of these higher density areas for them to have several of the trees. And so, like I've said in the past, you know, we're not doing anything to proactively remove any of those trees when we go in and we do road construction projects. And a lot of other communities have done that kind of work where they've been for the last decade removing ash trees from the boulevard, and as Chris had mentioned, you know, diversifying the tree species so that, you know, there's more of them out there. And so I just think that I think that the community is going to be pretty upset with us if we have a huge amount of dead trees in the next 4 years and that we didn't really do anything to help proactively manage that. And we just say, well, sorry, you know, we got this ordinance and so you're stuck having, you know, sorry you couldn't pay for, you know, the treatment back then, or maybe you didn't even know about it, but, you know, it is what it is and you're going to be, and all the residents are going to have to pay for the removal. And I think that they won't be able to pay for the removal and then the city will have to step in and start to take those down. And so that's where I'm getting at, where I think that we have to have a realistic conversation about what is it that we're going to do to address this issue. And so I know it's kind of uncomfortable, but I just don't think that the path that we're on right now is doing the greatest service that we can, you know, to our community and helping manage it. That's my 2 cents.
Councilmember Fulch, Councilmember Balsanic.
Thank you, Your Honor. And just underscoring what Councilmember Fulch is saying, you know, my whole life watching the political process, it just seems like government, whether it's local or national, is reactive as opposed to being proactive. And I see us going the route of being reactive here as opposed to doing something or things get bad. I'd like to see, Councilmember Fulch asked for a workshop. I'm not sure if a council workshop would be appropriate, with all due respect, but perhaps a council committee look at this and see if there's some way to tweak our ordinance. Because when, you know, when that ordinance was put together, that, you know, homeowners are going to take care of boulevard trees, there was never any inkling of any kind of infestation, for want of a better word, a pandemic in the urban forest that we have. I'd like to see us send this to a committee of the council. I'm not sure which one, administration, finance, somebody, Dan, maybe you can help us out here. Dan, our city administrator. Could we send this to the committee to take a look at and come back with maybe some financial figures that show us if we enter into agreements on ash trees only, just ash trees within the boulevard with homeowners, if we do some kind of a split, what's the cost benefit versus in 3, 4, 5 years having to spend thousands of dollars, tens of thousands of dollars to remove these trees? I guess what I can see is in 4 or 5 years, if we still have government, a local government assistance, LGA, you know, we get about $750,000 a year on that. I can see us taking that, and instead of buying some things for infrastructure, we're going to have to go and spend it on taking down trees. I'm not sure where the money's going to come from out of our budget. It's certainly not going to. I mean, if we took it out of Parks and Rec, it would devastate any of the programs that they're doing. And so we've got to look and find a way to solve this problem. So, Dan, is there an appropriate committee that we could send this to?
Dan Maticha? Thank you.
I would start probably with Parks and Rec or possibly operations, looking at it similar to infrastructure. But those are two suggestions.
Then is it appropriate for me to make a motion to send it to,
You don't need a motion.
I don't need one. I would just strongly urge that we do this,
Okay,
that we send it to, I don't know, operations, because operations does take care of trimming our trees, right? Parks Department does not do that. The maintenance of our trees.
And Mayor, if I can jump in here to answer a few questions. Councilmember Balsonic, the original program that we are currently under for treating ash trees came out of a recommendation from the Park and Rec Committee of Council. And just as a point of information, the choice is not mine, but just for information. A couple of other pieces of information, and again, no conclusions here, just sharing information with you all, is the statement or the thought that the city would be left, the city as an entity would be left holding the bag if all of these boulevard trees need to be removed. By ordinance, that is not the way that it works. The cost is borne by the property owner. And that could be significant, but even if the city contracts a tree removal company to remove the tree, remove the stump, and then come back and plant, that bill is going to be sent to that property owner, and by ordinance, ultimately, if not paid, assessed to taxes. That is just the way that it is written. Talking about notification, I can't remember if that was Councilmember Fulch or Balsonic that mentioned notification. Part of our program with Rainbow Tree Care and that partnership is a postcard is sent to every residential address in Hastings annually, whether people choose to look at that or not, but that is a step that we do take, along with communication through our newsletters annually, as well as social media posts, etc. Councilmember Balsonic, you discussed the ordinance a little bit, and I can't point to it as 100% fact, but the folks that were around Hastings during the Dutch elm disease informed me that this ordinance that deals with this was specifically written after Dutch elm disease devastated Hastings. And I believe Hastings, the entity, the city, was left holding the bag and paying for all that. So I think that's how we wound up with the ordinance that we have today.
Yes, and I thank you, Chris, for articulating on that. I'm old enough to remember the Dutch elm disease problem that was there. We were living in St. Paul when that.
Councilmember Balsonic, we have others that want to speak.
Oh, I'm just answering his.
Okay.
Yeah, just real quickly. Again, and I understand we're only going to help people that can prove that they were, treating their trees. Everybody else is on their own. But, in St. Paul, when I lived there, the city ended up going in there and taking them all out because it was a real safety problem. And I'm just trying to avoid that. Thank you, Your Honor.
Okay. Thank you. Councilmember Brox, I'm sorry.
Yes, thank you, Mayor. I just want to say I appreciate the conversation. I think it's been well pointed out what the issue is, and we have someone who's also presented us information with what we could do with it. The only thing that's standing in the way is a policy change. So I'd just like to suggest that we direct this to a committee if there's going to be a discussion about it and move on, just only because we spent 45 minutes talking about it. So that's all I wanted to say.
Thank you. Councilmember Lund.
Well, seeing as though I am the chair of both Parks and Ops, and the two people that join me are the exact same on both committees, it's almost moot. But let's just throw it to Parks, because we then would have Chris with us as well.
Thank you, Councilmember Lund. Chris, are you willing? You are willing.
Absolutely.
Okay. Thank you all. We'll move that to Parks first, and then the discussion will begin. Thank you. Council members, are there any corrections to the minutes of the regular meeting of June 15? Seeing none, they are approved. For public comments, at this point, we will take comments from the audience. We have options for comments to be mailed, emailed, or the meeting, as well as the interactive feature during the meeting. For the emailed comments, they have been forwarded to the City Council and their receipt is acknowledged. Please recognize that items not on the agenda will not be discussed this evening. We ask that the attendee use the raise hand feature, and they will be invited to speak one at a time. I also want to remind everyone that public comment period is not for dialogue. It is not intended for dialogue. Know that Mr. McCoy is in the audience and is wanting to speak. Okay. Mr. McCoy?
Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Well, first of all, I want to say thank you and good evening for your time, City Council. And what we're coming to the City Council to review tonight is a water line repair bill that we received for our resident at 1208 Tyler Street. Sent this bill from the city, noting that the city ordinance, by the city ordinance, that the homeowner is responsible for the repair of the portion of the water line. Although we feel the ordinance wording is open for interpretation and the cause of the leak is unknown, that's not the reason that we're coming to the council tonight. Reviewing the itemized invoices for the work performed, we feel that we're being asked to pay for additional costs were incurred because of the actions that were outside of our control. Those actions are related to overtime charges in the invoice and the cost of the pavement repair. This matter has been reviewed with the operations committee. Their response been sent to us where the actions were appropriate and we were responsible for the entire amount of the bill and the invoices. Agree with that response. And going back to the items in question, the overtime charges, the water line repair contains a labor overtime costs. Review, it was noted that this work was done as an emergency repair and overtime was necessary to make the repair. Not bear the cost of these overtime charges for two reasons. One, a suspected water leak was identified at that location in 2017. Certain if the leak was in the main or in the service line. It was done to investigate until the time the line was repaired, almost over 2 years later. And once the water was seen at the surface, the urgency of the repair increased. Decision to repair that bill had happened. Overtime cost didn't seem appropriate. First of all, the leak had been happening for at least 2 years, and why couldn't it wait another day is confusing to us. The thing is that within that two-year period, this wouldn't have turned in. It did not turn into an emergency repair because water was not seen at the surface until after the overlay project. Number two, that we feel we shouldn't bear the cost of those overtimes, or what the reason we question that overtime cost and why we're responsible for it. Understand that other repairs were done in that day on the same day with the same crew. We question why should we be responsible for those overtime costs versus the other projects. The total time elapsed in that repair was not over 8 hours. The cost that we're questioning is related to the pavement replacement, the repair cost. So that repair should be substantially less. Overall repair quality would be better if that was done to and as part of the overlay project. The water leak was identified in 2017. Pavement overlay project was performed. This project was completed in mid-July of 2019. Line repair was done in September of 2019. Part of that overlay projects, there were a number of other spots where the asphalt was completely removed to make modifications in the roads. The suspected water line leak, which would require complete asphalt removal to investigate. A proper due diligence step would have been to investigate the water line to protect the quality and integrity of the overlay project. Had those steps been taken and the pavement replaced as part of that overlay project, the cost of the replacement would have been significantly less. Based on the unit costing of the overlay project, the costing could have been 1/3 to 1/4 of the cost of the invoices that we received. We recognize this matter has been outstanding for some time, and we fully intend to resolve it in a very timely fashion. However, we want to make sure that we're not paying for costs that are above and beyond what that repair could have been. More detail and would be willing to discuss that at any point. And thank you again for your time.
McCoy. Councilmember Fulch.
Your Honor, I had sent an email earlier today asking that this be placed on the next council meeting so that we could have the opportunity to actually have a council quick discussion, as it's not actually actionable during the public comment period. Right.
Councilmember Fulch. Dan will put that on the agenda for July 20th. Thank you again, Mr. McCoy.
Thank you again.
Sure. Council, are there any items to be considered? Council, I would accept a motion to approve the consent agenda.
So moved.
Councilmember Fulch.
Second.
Councilmember Brox. Additional council discussion? Anderson, would you please call the roll?
Councilmember Vaughn.
Yes.
Councilmember Fulch.
Yes.
Councilmember Balsonic.
Yes.
Member Liefeld.
Yes.
Councilmember Lund.
Yes.
Councilmember Brox. Fassbender.
Yes. Motion prevails. Awarding of contracts, we award a contract to AEM Financial for their interim financial services. Tonight we have City Administrator Dan Waticha. Dan?
Thank you. This is actually part two, a follow through on an action that the council took, I believe at its last meeting. At the first meeting, we entered into a hour by the hour agreement with AEM Financial Solutions to assist with transitioning as our finance manager is taking another job in another town. This is more of the not just by the hour transition, but actually devoting that interim role, assisting particularly with a few areas during the time before we have that new finance manager hired on. So this is the agreement to bridge us through to the end of September. It's possible it could be shortened up if there's somebody hired in quicker than that. But it also is deliberately intended to get us past the preliminary levy part of the 2021 budget. So it's looking at some specific discrete duties that wanting to make sure we have some additional expertise on hand. The 2021 budget, issuing debt for this year's street construction project, some assistance with the CARES funds, finish, although it's not directly finishing it because the work's being done by Ellers, but sort of the follow through on the utility study that hopefully you'll be seeing in a couple of weeks, certainly by August. But covering those roles beyond the day-to-day accounting, making sure that we don't have those important things dropped before a new hire is brought on.
Okay.
But that's the short version of the proposal before you. If there are any questions, I can certainly stand for those.
Sure, thank you, Dan. Council, any discussion? Okay. Council would accept a motion to accept the awarding of a contract for AEM Financial Solution to provide interim financial management services until September 30th, 2020.
So moved.
Councilmember Lund.
Second.
Seconded by Councilmember Vaughn. Any other additional discussion? Clerk Henderson, please call the roll.
Councilmember Vaughn. Councilmember Fultz.
Yes.
Councilmember Fultz.
Yes.
Councilmember Balsonic.
Yes.
Member Liefeld.
Yes.
Member Lund.
Yes.
Councilmember Brox.
Yes.
Mayor Fassbender.
Yes. Motion prevails. Thanks, Dan. This item is also introduced by Dan Maticha on the CARES Act funding.
Looking at the screen share. Tonight I want to give you really just a have you guys got it on your side?
Yes.
Thank you. A quick overview, trying to hit some highlights of the CARES Act funding that the city will be receiving, discussing some of the eligibility criteria, and then also some of the parameters or best practices for helping the council decide how best to use the money. We're looking at a little over $1.7 million for eligible expenses, basically response to COVID. I'll get into the eligibility criteria in another slide. There is a state certification process. There are reporting requirements to the state monthly. At some point during the middle of this process and a final report. Because it is federal money significantly over the legal threshold, it will trigger what's called a single audit. So it's an added piece to the city's financial audit next year. It's important to note it's not just a checklist item. It's something that it's an audit, but the piece that's a little bit concerned to it is we don't know specifically what guidance the federal government will give auditors 12 months down the road. So as I comment with some of our next steps, we'll want to make sure we do our best to stay ahead of that audit. And we have had a couple of other grants and are looking at some additional pieces of funding. Probably goes without saying, but no double dipping. So we'll need to make sure that we keep things discreetly tracked and documented. Mentioning that financial audit, there is a requirement that if we misspend any of this money, it has to be paid back. So we want to make sure that we follow the rules. And most importantly, some real recommendation that the state's management and budget office was commenting last week is document. Make sure that wherever we make decisions on using some of this money, we're not just documenting here's a receipt that how the money was spent, but documenting the management or city council decisions on why we believe that that was an eligible expense and met the criteria. And I think the key piece to that is this is a lot of money. It's roughly 5% of our overall budget if you looked at debt service and utilities and everything. So it's a significant amount suddenly being added to the city to spend by mid-November. And really, I think that there's a policy piece that it's your responsibility to have some good discussion around how to use it. There are only 3 criteria on how the money can be spent. One, it has to be a necessary expenditure due to the COVID response. 2, it has to be either unbudgeted presently or substantially different from our budget. So we might have, as an example, we might have budgeted staff time to be working on maybe ambulance is a good example. We might have had staff time budgeted for ambulance, but we weren't expecting them to be responding specifically to COVID. So either the item was unbudgeted, we had no thought that we were going to be buying thousands of dollars of masks and plexiglass and disinfectant wipes, but some of it might have been things that we expected to spend money on, but really had to redirect it a different direction. The third eligibility criteria is that it's spent during this COVID period from March 1 to November 15th is the deadline. So it's a few months out. It's fairly quick. All 3 criteria need to be met. In my memo, outlining the CARES Act to you for tonight, I listed a few broad areas that you might consider, and I want to present those briefly to generate some discussion tonight, hopefully lead you for future discussions. One area, city finances. I would hope that where the city has already incurred expenses, whether it's for purchases or for payroll, I would hope that the city council would look at repaying the city. Through April, we had about $30,000 of expenses and an estimated $100,000 in payroll specific to COVID. And that was just in the first month that we were dealing with it. We have some updated estimates later this evening for the month of May. And obviously, we've got a few months ahead of us that this is still playing out. A second item that I think the council should have some discussion around is substantially dedicated payroll. The guidance documents from the federal government, U.S. Treasury, indicate that for public safety payroll, as a matter of administrative convenience, assuming it meets, you're able to defend the 3 criteria, that it was necessary, that it was unplanned, unbudgeted, and that it was during that time period. But the key one being necessary for COVID response. The guidance says you could consider payroll for public safety as meeting that COVID piece. You don't need to track and document. Looking at the attorney, we don't need to track it on 15 or 10-minute increments in order to make sure that we nail every piece. You could simply say we have payroll, but you'll need to be able to document that it was substantially doing COVID-related response, not just running speed traps or responding to non-COVID crimes on the police side. So anyways, I think that's a broad area to have some discussion. A third is that it can be used for economic support for businesses, specifically where their business was interrupted due to COVID, particularly if there was an ordered closure of the businesses. We know that many of our retailers were closed, I think, for up to 3 months entirely. And other service businesses also have reduced and still today have reduced or occupancy limits. An item I did not and should have included in the cover memo for tonight is emergency financial assistance. CARES Act can be used to assist individuals impacted by a loss of income due to COVID. So it isn't just a matter of is there support that we might give to businesses? There might be thoughts to giving support to individuals. And it's easy to look at the newspapers up in Minneapolis or even on Dakota County with costs that they've incurred sheltering homeless populations in order to minimize some of the spread. But possibly there's some things going forward that we would look at. Are there needs in our community that could be supported directly? And the other piece I think is worth considering as a broad topic is building upgrades. So are there some communication technology type pieces we might put into our facilities in order to facilitate being able to meet remotely or be able to have social distancing in meetings? Might we consider changing out faucets and towels and drinking fountains so that they're all touchless and limit the spread of COVID, or other building improvements, potentially some HVAC improvements, but honestly, I don't know we could get that completed by November. But these are a few broad areas that, in terms of some of the city operations or comments I've heard out in the community, seem to fit the CARES Act criteria. I'm sure that there's other examples, but want to begin having that discussion tonight. So I think I see as next steps for the council. One, just recognizing that this is an important policy discussion, $1.7 million. And it's something that all of you should have responsibility at working through what are the decisions on how best to use that in Hastings and making those basically budgetary decisions. Initially, it's probably setting some parameters of direction around those broad areas. We probably wouldn't address all half dozen of them. And it's possible that there's one or two of them that you think are dead on arrival, and let's not spend a lot of time investigating or debating those, and or even if they're worth debating, is there some limits on how far you want to go with those, and trying to that we can work through important discussions expeditiously. I referred earlier the importance of document. That's not just a matter of saying, here's a receipt to show that we made this purchase, but really documenting, particularly on things that may be more discretionary, the council's thought process, the rationale for the decisions, and really trying to be prepared in advance of that financial audit. We don't know what questions the audit's going to look for, but if we have the decisions documented well, hopefully it answers whatever questions might be asked later. State has requested that any questions that cities have, we route those through our partner agencies such as the League of Cities or Metro Cities. They don't want to be inundated with 850 some cities plus the counties, so they'd rather run them through partners, which certainly makes sense. And just noted in next steps, expect that staff will submit the paperwork, the certification by the July 20th date, at which point money will be available towards the end of this month. A lot of material there, but really wanted to highlight the criteria that need to be met, some of the thought process that you guys will have to work through in order to make sure that we document decisions and point out, at least broadly, some of the areas that you might look at using $1.7 million to respond to COVID here in the city of Hastings. With that, I'll stand for questions, or I think obviously whatever discussion you guys want to have among yourselves. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Dan. Councilmember Vaughn.
Thank you, Your Honor. Dan, could you check to see, most likely with the Confluence project, that improvement pavement that we would expect at the end of the year, can we use this money to the bonding bill for that portion that we're going to have to pay for?
The quick answer is the CARES Act cannot be used to cover any revenue shortfall. So if it's a concern with some sort of tip shortfall with the Confluence being delayed, it can't cover that gap. It might be possible to structure it a little bit differently. In essence, sort of a grant to Confluence, in which case the city would be providing money to Confluence in order to help Confluence with its expenses related to economic support related to its being closed or delayed by COVID, in which case it would assist it in making those payments. I really want to trouble through some of those scenarios, but I think that's an example of where it gets gray and murky, really needing the council to have some discussion around, does this make sense? Does it fit the criteria? And being able to document that thought process. It's something to look into. I'm a bit skeptical at first blush, but I think it's something we can look into.
Thank you. And Your Honor, all I ask is staff keep an eye on this and look at the opportunity as, I look at it as an expense to the city. I don't look at it as revenue loss. We have an agreement, but we're going to have an expense that's going to face us again this year that it's got to get paid from somewhere. So it's going to come out of the general tax dollars, is what I'm assuming. So I was hoping that potentially this could be used for that. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Vaughn. Councilmember Lund, did you want to speak?
Yeah, I just, Dan, you had defined, or you had specified at one of your three requirements being that it's necessary. When we do have this conversation, if we could have a real tight definition of, what is and is not necessary, I think that'll help whittle down our ideas quickly as well. So you don't have to have that right now, but that can be that could be a interpreted word. So if we could have a good definition of that, that'd be great.
We'll certainly see what we can do to give a better interpretation, it's going to be ambiguous. There was during the webinar hosted by the League of Cities last week, which had, I forget her name, but from the state's management and budget office, who is in the department that specifically is overseeing the CARES money, not just the money to Hastings and other cities, but the $2 billion of CARES money to the state. When she was asked a very specific yes/no question that was one of these open to interpretation, is this necessary or not? She tap danced all around it, and that's where the document came from. Is nail it down on a specific definition. That's why make sure that the council's decision process is laid out so that there's something to pull back and use as defense if it's questioned in the future. So we'll certainly see if there's examples in the guidance that might help to narrow it, but it's going to be fluid.
Okay. Thank you, Councilmember Fulch.
Thank you, Your Honor. So I also listened in on the LMC webinar that was in regards to that, and that's that's exactly what she said, and why it is really important that we have these double deliberations. Something that Councilmember Vaughn had said in regards to the confluence payment, and I think that there's enough documentation that can show that that has nothing to do with COVID. That was about planning on their part and getting their finances in order and such, and that they had some struggles with that. It didn't really necessarily have anything to do with COVID, and so I wouldn't feel comfortable trying to defend that was COVID related if in case we were audited. And trust me, we have to be prepared to be audited. And I don't mean just like the regular audits that the city gets where they bring in an account and they just look at the numbers. I mean, I would assume that they're going to possibly have like someone from, I don't know, the legislative auditor's office or something like that, where they come through and they actually do look more rigorously through to make sure that funds were expended properly. But with that said, looking at the memo that Dan had put together, thank you for doing that, Dan. It was very helpful. And so I agree that the city's finances, your first bullet point, that we should be covering the costs that the city has directly incurred. Dan had shared with me that staff have been keeping logs of the amount of time that they have been spending on various components to pandemic response. That would probably be anywhere, from buying, masks, as he had said, into like John Hinsman's time of how he has spent with the downtown business association. And so you had indicated there, it looks like you have $148,000 worth of expenditures that you currently have documented. And I would ask that you make a guesstimate as to, how much you might need as a set aside, because we only have until November 15th to be able to spend this money, which is only 4 months. In government terms, that is the blink of an eye. I mean, I'm fearful that we don't have enough time to have a lot of deliberations where we have to be, perhaps, after we're done with this, we break up into groups and form little smaller committees that talk about various issues to come up with plans, just because we don't have a lot of time to spin our wheels, council meeting after council meeting after council meeting. The second thing that I wanted to say was, and then in regards to businesses, you indicate in your memo that you've spent a total of $221,000 to date, which were the HEART grants that went to the individual businesses. And then you go on to say there was an additional expenditure, I think the $25,000 to deal with the downtown closures, and then another $27,000 for the business license refunds. And so I think that should also be a part of, that we use the CARES Act for, just to make sure that we're covering all of the expenditures that we've had to date. And so those two things together, when I tallied them, that's $369,000 that we've already spent, which leaves $1.3 million yet to be expended. And so that's where begin to look at the other areas that you've suggested in your memo. And so I think that we can have further deliberation about economic support for businesses. But I don't want to be a time hog here. I just wanted to kind of get that out there, and maybe we could have agreement that we should reimburse the city first for the things that we've had expenditures on. I don't know how to do this, if we're supposed to make a motion or just a suggestion and we all kind of nod and agree with that, or.
Like, I think it's just discussion, maybe.
I think that some discussion, even if it's a consensus type piece, is adequate tonight. If we're not expecting to have the money in hand until the end of July, and even have another scheduled council meeting before then, we can do some of the formality as we get closer to actually writing checks.
Okay. Any other discussion, council? No comments? Okay. Dan, then we'll put it on our next agenda.
I saw a hand from Councilmember Fulch.
Oh,
Councilmember Fulch, sorry.
okay, thank you. I just wanted to come up for breath before I continued on to see that if there was agreement that we should cover our expenditures that we've had to date. So what I also wanted to say is that on the second bullet point about substantially dedicated payroll, that makes me a little nervous to use funds for that. In grant making terms, there's something called where when you already have something that's budgeted and then you try to use grant funds for it, and it's usually staff related, it's called supplanting. So like, for instance, like if Dan, we normally pay for Dan to work 80 hours a week, and we pay him, I'm just gonna say something like $2,000 for that 80 hours a week. And then we try to say, oh, but Dan we're gonna say, oh, we want to charge 30% of his time towards COVID. That's called supplanting. And it just makes me nervous to use the funds for something that we already had budgeted for, even though perhaps the fire and police might be dealing more so with this. It just makes me a little nervous when we look at substantially dedicated payroll and using the funds for that. I totally believe in if they can say, if they have their logs and they can say, yes, I spent this number of hours working on pandemic plans and buying supplies and building whatever, but if it was directly, I think that is completely valid and I support that. But if it is kind of that gray area, that makes me a little bit more nervous. Just having grant experience.
Thank you. Councilmember Lund.
Thank you. And we probably should, make this conversation part of a bigger conversation at another time. But didn't Dan's presentation say specifically that it couldn't be budgeted for already? It had to be unbudgeted. Is that correct, Dan?
The second criteria is that it is either unbudgeted or the terminology, but in some fashion, significantly redirected. So from that example, if somebody's time was 80 hours working on administration, a significant portion of those 80 hours were in some fashion tracked or in the public safety area just assumed to be working specific for COVID instead of whatever administrative work they might normally have been doing. So it's budgeted but redirected towards COVID instead of what they should have been working on. That meets that criteria. But I think that, again, that's an example of documenting the council's thought process. Are we comfortable that this is something that that was redirected rather than originally being budgeted?
Okay, Councilmember Brooks.
Yeah, just to add to what Dan said, the person I think of when you're talking about that is John Hinsman. and a lot of the work that he did when related to the business loan program and also all the additional support that we wanted to give small business in Hastings. I know that he's normally paid to do economic development work, but that was way above and beyond his normal course of duty. And so I just wanted to mention him also because I saw him coming into the office on his day off. So I think he deserves some recognition for a lot of the work that he's been doing. And I'm sure there's other people too who have been working hard on those programs. So I just wanted to say, to me, that's an example where he was doing a lot of extra work on specifically COVID related plans. So I don't know if that fits into the category, but that's the first example that comes to my mind.
Thank you, Councilmember Brox. Councilmember Fulch.
Thank you. I agree with Councilmember Brox wholeheartedly, and thank you, John. You've been doing an awesome job. But I guess that's where the confusion kind of lies, is between these categories, because as I read the memo prepared by Dan, he says under the first bullet, which is city finances, that he had $15,000 of unbudgeted payroll in there. And I'm not sure if that's overtime or if that's, like, as you had mentioned, like all the time that John has specifically spent already on the work that he's done. And so that's, so yes, I agree. I'm just not, as I'm reading the memorandum though, under that second bullet of substantially dedicated payroll, the way it looks like is that we would just be looking at the normal payroll. For instance, it's the last paragraph underneath the second bullet where Dan spells out what are, that we have $7.2 million in annual payroll and benefits for police, fire, and ambulance. You subtract out the months. Outside of the eligibility period leaves $5.1 million in payroll and benefits that could be administratively deemed as eligible under the current guidance. This is, so it technically fits within the guidance, but it's, again, it's, I guess that's where I'm like, I'm not sure what to think about
If I
that.
can, for a more articulate discussion, we'll get more specific payroll data for you. The $15,000 unbudgeted is, I believe, entirely overtime related to ambulance. The example given of John Hensman's time, even though it might have been above and beyond normal duties, is going to be falling into that budgeted, redirected $100,000 figure, which is also picking up police and other administrative pieces, and even fire and ambulance and police during sort of budgeted hours. That unbudgeted piece is strictly an overtime figure.
Okay, Councilmember Brox.
So that category, and this question maybe is for Dan, it's basically to, but for COVID, they would have been working on something else. It's meant to compensate people who would have been working on something else, but instead they were specifically working on COVID. So although they are still doing their job, they're specifically working on an issue that arose only because of COVID. Is that the right way to understand it?
Yeah, I think with how something might be budgeted but redirected to COVID is, we were expecting community development. We were expecting police and ambulance to be working full time and doing certain things. We just did not expect them to be working on COVID, and it took them away and was putting them into these other, into COVID instead of taking care of other important priorities in the city.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Councilmember Balsanic.
Yes, I'm looking at that same couple of paragraphs that Councilmember Fulch had mentioned. I'm a little perplexed here. It says, for this reason, and as a matter of administrative convenience, in light of the emergency nature of this program, a local government may presume that payroll costs for public safety employees are payments for services substantially dedicated to mitigating or responding to the COVID. Are we boxing out people like John Hinsman and Rusty Fifield. If we're saying public safety employees, are those your words, or Dan, or are those your words, or are you quoting from the directive?
One, it does not box out community development or other staff time. And yes, that is a quote from the CARES Act guidance, frequently asked questions, most recent update, June 24th. What that is getting at is for public safety employees, because of the nature of their job, it says if the council is confident that those public safety employees, police and fire, ambulance, probably police and ambulance, were substantially working in response to COVID. And I'll go back to that document, to step away from the quote, be able to back up why you're confident that they were substantially related to COVID. Then you don't have to track through the payroll that degree of specificity. You can just assume that they were, that all the hours were for COVID. But it comes back to based on the number of people on a shift, based on the number of calls we were having, based on the number of calls that were flagged at dispatch as a potential COVID positive person at that residence that they're responding to. If it's looking at on the police side, reductions in crime rates, because the flip side, part of our having lower crime rates is because we're instead working on COVID and not going on some calls we might not normally have, lower priority calls. So if based on some factors, if you're comfortable making the decision that we believe that these public safety positions were substantially working towards COVID, you need to document the decision, even if you're not documenting each hour. That's different than looking at non-public safety positions, in which case you're going to need to document the hours. Or as Councilmember Fulch said, she's not comfortable making that broad decision and would rather see, even in the public safety realm, we look at actual documented hours rather than that convenience assumption.
Yeah, I mean, I see where you're coming from. And I'm not putting you on the spot here, but it's like we're coming up with our own definitions to fit the criteria. So Public Works went and fixed up the historic downtown with the temporary sidewalks and so on and so forth. Is that going to be
pause right there. Public Works is not a public safety position.
There you go. Okay.
You would have to look at their actual tracked hours to see. Nick was in a staff meeting talking about COVID. The GIS people were drawing up maps to look at the downtown in order to help you guys look at how many parking spaces might be lost or where the detours would be set up. Nick and John met with the sign people on site in order to show here's where to place the barricades and delineators. Public safety might very well have been, or not public safety, Public Works might very well have been spending a number of hours COVID response, but because it's not public safety, we know Public Works is not substantially dedicating time to COVID, we would need to specifically track public works hours. If public safety ambulance is going to be doing a ton of COVID, they allow the ability to decide based on some additional information or data to just determine public safety automatically was COVID responding rather than needing to track each hour.
Right,
But
okay.
you have to keep them separate. Public safety only has that potential.
Okay.
exception.
Your Honor, I have another question, but does anybody else want to speak?
I see no one. Go ahead, Councilmember Bolsonic.
I just want to put in a word for our local businesses. And we're going to have to come up with some kind of criteria. It says it says in the directive that we can economic support for business funding to be used for expenses associated with the economic support in connection with the COVID, provision of grants to small businesses, reimburse the cost of business interruption and so forth. Anecdotally, there is the thought that at least 10% of the CARES funding is recommended to be used for business support. So are we, it says local business, so we're going to be avoiding things like Speedway, Holiday, Walmart, places like that, and we're going to be, I'm assuming, dealing with true local businesses. Question for Dan.
There's a couple of pieces there. One, one being a question of, is it local or not? And I don't know well enough about Speedway or Walmart that you mentioned, but I'll use Subway as an example. I know that the 3 Subway franchises, I know the Culver's franchise, are owned and operated by local people. So even though it might be a national chain, be careful before I just said that's not a local business.
Exactly.
So one would be looking at the local. The other is the guidance says it is for small businesses, and I've seen definitions of 20 and 25 employees. So or full-time equivalent employees. So maybe a Subway or maybe a Speedway might fit that small definition. Walmart, I'm sure, is out of the picture.
Yeah, a number of employees would be, I think, a good place to start. Another place would be something like Perkins or Applebee's, which are, I think, are locally owned. They're franchised. They're not owned by the corporation. And then from there you go to, like you say, number of employees. Okay, good. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Any other discussion, Councilmember Fulch?
Thank you, Your Honor. Going along with what Councilmember Balsanic was just saying, just to clarify, I mentioned it earlier, and it's in Dan's memo, that we've already spent $221,000 to date under businesses, and so that's 13% of the $1.7 million that's been allocated to us. So we have kind of met like what the minimum suggested amount is for the business community. However, I think that it would be a good idea for that we have the COVID economic assistance business task force that's been meeting several times over the last few months to come up with some recommendations. I think that it would be a good idea for that group just to reconvene and to look at where have we been. I know that our Chamber just released another business survey to the community, asking how things are going. I know that John has of the 70 grants that we gave out, they have all the contact information, and so I don't know. I haven't heard confirmation whether or not all those have been put into like an email list that we could do an email blast to all those 70 and ask, hey, how are things going? And then to look at what's going on, also right now, the Department of Employment and Economic Development currently has $10,000 loan grants that are out there. I think that's up to 50 employees for businesses. They're considering that a small business. And Commissioner Slavic has mentioned during our Friday chamber call with the business community that they're looking at also utilizing the deed grant program. And let me stop there for a second. It's a lottery program. And so it's just, if you apply, you cross your fingers and hope, and you might get a grant. And so they're hoping to utilize that database of information that comes in and look then at giving grants within the county. Dan had told me during a phone conversation, Dan, maybe you want to just a little bit about maybe an opportunity to partner in the future with the county in providing further economic assistance to the business community. But I think that there's some additional options there. One of the limitations of the grant funds, or I'm sorry, the CARE funds, is that we can't use it to compensate for lost revenue. And so, like for instance, we waived the fees for the on-sale liquor license for the restaurants for that first half. So that $2,200 for each restaurant, we can't ask for that. We can't ask for the CARE funds to reimburse us for that. But I mean, if we looked at it in a different spin, for instance, if we gave grants now to all of those businesses, for instance, I'm making something up here, if we gave them all a $2,500 grant and then they still paid their, their liquor license when that came due, right? Maybe there's an offset there, and it's how you package it. And so there might be some opportunities to be creative. I think it wouldn't even be such a bad idea, because I know John is working really hard and he's losing Rusty. I think Rusty's last day was maybe last Friday or this Monday or something like that. So he's a one-man show now. How are we going to help John? I would be fully in favor of doing a little staff augmentation and bringing in a consultant, or I don't know, someone to help John, in administering some of this. And so I think that and you guys, I mean, just so you know, now is the time to have this conversation. We're not having this conversation later. Right now is the time. If you have thoughts that you want to be providing on all of this, that we need to have a robust conversation. We need to do, and as I mentioned earlier, time is kind of the essence. And so I would love to see the task force get together and have a more in-depth conversation just specifically about what more we could be doing with, the business community, and then maybe come back with recommendations. But that's just a thought that I have on that.
We had actually talked about it and waiting after the chamber survey to come in too, which I think Christy said it was at the end of this weekend. So I'll try to set something up for next week if that information is at hand. John, did you have something to say?
Yeah, Mayor, Council Member, having the Economic Development Task Force look at ideas, I think that's a good idea. I just want to be careful on the parameters that we're giving to the Economic Development Task Force at this point. As Dan had mentioned in his memo, there are a number of different pots, if you want to call them, in which we may be expending things on. My understanding with the Economic Development Task Force is we'd be looking at things specifically for business assistance at this point, what businesses need, and really that would be the limit of what we would be doing. I just wanted to make sure that that was the understanding of the council at this point.
Yes, and that's what I meant.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Yes, Mayor.
Councilor Dan?
If I could piggyback on a couple of the comments there. I heard reference to the chamber doing a survey, and I know that we had done a survey prior to the park grant a couple months back. But that's a great example of documenting the decision process. If the recommendation is at least 10% towards business assistance and Hastings has already done 13, somebody might ask, why are we looking at doing more? Or how do we justify doing more? Having that survey data from a couple of surveys, or being able to look at I know the numbers. We've got 1,000 businesses in Hastings, and we provided 60 grants, and maybe we can look at by sector or something. But having that additional data, having that chamber survey saying yes, there's still need, or here's the types of need that's still not being met, really, I hope helps inform the council's decision. Also gives us something concrete, or at least on paper, to fall back on and say, here's why the council made that decision. It wasn't just a number pulled out of the air. So I'm excited to hear the chambers taking the lead on that survey.
Okay. Councilmember Fulch.
Your Honor, I have a couple things. And then under the building upgrades, Dan, I was wondering, do you actually have staff looking at what kinds of facility modifications maybe need to be able to deal with COVID? Like I've seen in some businesses, like where they install at the bottom of a door, it's like a little kickstand thing that you grab with your foot to open up a door, or like the chamber, our council chambers. I heard someone say something about maybe putting plexiglass in between us. So I don't know, do you have someone actually working and looking at what some of the building modifications are that you're thinking about, or have they already been done and they're already being captured in your expenditures to date?
They're both. Some of the low cost expenditures to date might fall into the May or June categories. I don't think anything fell into April. But those are fairly low cost. Other a little bit higher cost items are being quoted either by IT staff or by facilities management. So yes, we are getting prices on what does a additional computer monitor and stand for the community upstairs do. And the reason being, having one downstairs in the volunteer room, social distancing, we might have a meeting with 3 people. If we need a larger meeting, we're going to have to go upstairs to the community room, and it's not set up with the appropriate technology to have an effective meeting under their safety environment. So some of that's being quoted. Kurt is getting pricing on changing out all the hand dryers and drinking fountains, faucets, to see what it would cost in order to automate those so that we're eliminating frequently touched surfaces, particularly in a bathroom environment. Don't know what those prices are going to come in at. The other piece, which admittedly I don't think we have time with the November deadline, but part of our city hall improvements anticipate, if it works through the budget process, anticipate about $250,000 for air conditioning and air handling in City Hall next year. Some of the guidance and requirements actually from the CDC has been to increase the airflow and have more fresh air circulating in the buildings. And I'll tell you what, our air conditioner is not keeping up. It's stuffy. We're pumping in more air, more outside air than what we might normally have been doing, because we're trying to have airflow and keep it basically pass the germs out and keep it safe. I really, it's one of those gray areas, have some discussion around it, but in order to meet those CDC requirements, might we need to upgrade our air conditioners in which case, if the CARES Act pays for it this year, I don't know if we can get it in by November 15th, going through a bidding process and construction, but if the CARES Act paid for $250,000 this year, our taxpayers aren't paying $250,000 next year, or aren't seeing it put into a bonding, a bond requirement that the taxpayers are paying over the next 10 years. So that's also some piece that we're trying to get some numbers on, but I think is less likely. The touchless items, the little toe kick at the bottom of the door, some plexiglass, that's either just automatically happening if it's fairly low dollar and we need it, or if it's more of the touchless items, we'll be getting you some numbers to see what that might cost.
I would also suggest that up in that community room, if that's where we're going to start having our council meetings, the lighting is really awful up there also. So I don't know how to fix it, but it is pretty bad.
The room's tough to work with because of the historic nature. It's tough to get approvals to actually make improvements in the room. It's not impossible, but it's difficult. So that's where putting in place a monitor on a stand certainly is doable. Mounting monitors on the wall, like in the council chambers, is probably not approvable through the State Historic Preservation Organization. At this point, I don't know that we're moving council meetings up there regularly, where we're looking at some options to put basically plexiglass dividers across the dais so that everybody's in their own little cubicle. But we're not at that point yet.
Okay. Is that Councilmember Fulch?
No, and then my last point was, I know that we can also use the funds for individual assistance. I'm not seeing a bullet for it.
Yeah.
It's not, you only have 4 bullets here, and I'm not seeing it listed there that for economic assistance, economic support. Wait, no, there's for businesses, but then we can also, I think somewhere in there is about giving economic assistance. Individuals, like for instance, people who are being due to job loss or helping food shelves and stuff like that. And so I would like to see some of the funds be expended if we can talk, like as a, for instance, just pulling something out of my hat here is talking to Chris Coop and asking her, like, well, what do they foresee the needs being for the next 6 months at the Hastings Family Resource Center? Because I know that their volumes of need are really going up. And so I think that that's another angle we should be examining, and then start to look at what are all the possible asks that we have, and then start making that judgment call as to how much we want to appropriate for each. But if that's something that we can be using the funds for, I mean, I don't feel good about just helping businesses and not helping individuals as well. And so if there's something that we can be doing to help our local nonprofits or partnering with the county public health or something that to that effect, I think that should be a great option as well.
Sure.
Yeah, the written memo I gave you in advance of this meeting, I did not mention individual assistance. I did touch on it during the brief PowerPoint presentation, but you're right, that is an eligible area. I spoke with a board member of Hastings Family Services earlier today, and he's going to have some additional conversations with Chris Cope in order to have at least a feel for, is there some room there that, what assistance would be beneficial, potentially working through them. But in terms of types of individual assistance, it might be some sort of emergency transportation or job search, some sort of eviction foreclosure assistance, obviously food assistance. They're actually, through the state, there's a piece of the state to the counties, there's a piece of the CARES Act that's already earmarked specifically to funding food shelves, including the Hastings Family Services. But there might be areas that the city council thinks is appropriate to assist and help augment.
Is there a subcommittee or a group that we can, or do we want to maybe form a task force that just looks specifically at individual assistance and what kind of recommendations can be made there? Because we don't really have a health and human services type of committee of the council, nor do we have a commission that would deal with those kinds of issues. And so that's why I throw it out there so that we don't lose that piece and that we give it a little bit of, I mean, I shouldn't say a little bit. I think that we should give it deliberate thought as to how it is that we could include, so that a portion of the money, at least we're considering, providing that, rather than, I'm not sure who it is, which of the board members, if it was it Wolski? He sits on the board, or of one of our police officers.
Wolski sits on the board at Hastings Family Services. Yes.
Right. So, I don't know, does anyone else have any thoughts? I mean, if the task force is gonna look at business outreach, how else is that we can start dividing this up? Because like I said, you guys, we don't have enough time. We only have 4 months. And in government terms, like if we have to follow, like, as Dan was saying, bidding requirements and pulling together recommendations, if we wanted to do another round of grant funds for other purposes, it's like, it has to get out the door kind of fast. And so we don't have months of deliberation here. We should really try to make a conscious decision as to how it is that we're going to move forward, I would say, in the next 2 to 3 weeks. So that gives at least 3 weeks for the money to be expended. Again, November 15th is the deadline. What we don't use gets rolled to the county. And so it's snooze, you lose. So I think that we should do what we can to utilize the $1.7 million to its fullest to be able to aid the community. Otherwise, it's going to go to the county and they can spend it however they want.
Okay. Thank you, Councilmember Fulch. Councilmember Balsanic.
Thank you, Your Honor. I'm getting back to business, economic support for business. Saying here, Dan, that anecdotally, there is the thought that at least 10% of the CARES funding is recommended to be used for business support. That would be 174,000 at 10%. I would suggest 200,000 for business support. That gets us, more than the 10%. And in terms of what Councilmember Fulch was just saying, task force, where, could somebody sit down and promote some recommendations? I would suggest the administrative committee of the council.
Okay. Thank you, Councilmember Balsanic. Any other council discussion? Councilmember Brox.
I just want to ask Dan, what do you see as next steps, and what specific information or direction are you looking for? Anything actionable, or are we just, what's the next step?
I dropped my pen. In terms of next steps with the council, if there are some sort of committees that you want to discuss pieces of this, the Economic Development Task Force obviously is an existing committee that plugs in real well. If you wanted to ask administrative or any other grouping, you even make a new committee to look at a specific issue, building renovations or individual assistance, you certainly could have a group try to work towards what are some of the needs or what are some of the questions around that topic. I think there's a few other, maybe it's not next steps for you, but some other pieces that I've heard, for example, having staff pull together some better data about payroll and what's been tracked and incurred already and what's projected going forward, so that you can start to look at, here's this whole picture. I heard 1.7, and we've spent 300,000 or 400,000 already, so call it 1.3 that we still have. Well, if we project forward, we're expecting hypothetically another $500,000 just in existing track payroll. It's not 1.3 now; it's 800,000. So just trying to look at where some of these dollar limits are, so you can start to see what you have to work with. I think is a next step, even though it's not on the council. I think it's something that I need to have staff work on, so that your next meeting has that at hand.
Councilmember Vaughn.
Yeah, there with that, if
sorry.
there's some specific questions, I might pull up the payroll as a comment, but there's some other specific areas that, hey, I want more information on what does touchless facilities cost. We're working on it, but ask those specific questions where you see some pieces you want additional information.
Okay. Councilmember Vaughn.
Thank you, Your Honor. I give staff credit here. I think they're doing what they're working on. They're getting the info. They're looking for ways that we can utilize these dollars. And I think we're just looking for the policy point to point them in a direction to say, I agree with that. And I'm agreeing with staff. It sounds like they're on it. And I think we should, in 2 weeks, if we could let staff know if to say, hey, it's important to do facility upgrades. That's as bland as I want to be to say, bring that forward. I think that's something we should look at trying to reimburse. I'd rather us not get into picking this part over that part. I want staff to keep plugging away. It sounds like you got a good start on it, Dan. Your memo's laid out pretty well here. So I'm supportive of staff. Keep plugging away, and in 2 weeks, put some numbers in front of us, and I'll give you a thumbs up or thumbs down if I think that's the right direction of where we're at. Thank you.
Councilmember Vaughn. Councilmember Lund.
I'll keep it quick. I agree with Councilmember Vaughn.
All right, thank you. So Dan, there you have it. Continue what you're doing, and we'll look at July 20th for an update.
Thank you much. Thank you much. Although it's continue what I'm doing, it really is continue what staff's doing. I've got a lot of departments that got their fingers on this.
Okay, great. Thank you. Councilmember Fulch.
Thank you, Your Honor. I am concerned about the individual assistance. I mean, I understand if, I'm sorry, I'm going to mess up Dave Wolski's title, but I mean, I think that we should be giving more thought to individual assistance rather than just, just having, one discussion with Hastings Family Service. I think that we should be looking at, well, what are the possibilities that are within the community where assistance might be needed? And so I don't, Councilmember Brox, I know you're the chair there, but I thought it was a thoughtful suggestion by Councilmember Balsonic that maybe the administrative task force look at what can we do to help in the area of individual assistance. We don't necessarily have a staff member within the city staff that deals with individual assistance in those types of more of those health and human services types of issues. And so maybe I'm wrong, but I can't, I'm trying to think of everybody who's on staff, and I can't think of anybody that actually does that kind of work. And so I don't know if that could maybe be collaborating with the county to see what the county recommends in providing support to the community. I don't know if it's through our faith-based community, if, what kind of outreach that they've been doing. I know like our local YMCA, they've been giving away free meals, lunch and dinners to folks who come in every day, and they're providing that service as well. So I know that there are there's other resources within the community who are trying to help fill that need for people who have lost their jobs and have limited income. And so I just, I think that that's an area that we should be heavily considering, since the money can be expended in that. Although I agree that we should be looking at business building upgrades as well. I just don't want this piece to get lost in our community. And so, Councilmember Brox, what do you think?
Mayor, is it okay for me to speak?
Sure, go ahead, Councilmember Brox.
So I understand what you're asking. I guess I'm a part of several different food programs. One is Loaves and Fishes in the Twin Cities, and the other is our own church's food distribution. The interesting thing about it is that we haven't seen increased demand from at least those two organizations that I've been involved with. The demand has stayed very static. If it had increased, I think we would hear about it. And these are both local. They provide the meals both to the Y through their central kitchen, and they do a homeless feeding program out of West St. Paul that we go to every other month. So from what I've seen, I don't know what the need is. So I don't want to presume to understand what these organizations need. I think it's fine for us to reach out and ask if there's additional needs they're experiencing and what those needs are. I haven't personally witnessed, and I don't know what they would need. So I don't want to presume to understand what those organizations are facing. It's a little weird to put it on administrative committee, only because administrative is, more personnel oriented. But if that's what the council would like to do, then I'd be more than willing to accept, that issue to arrive in the administrative committee and work with it.
Okay, Councilmember Fulch.
Well, I'm a member of the administrative committee with Councilmember Brox and then Councilmember Liefeld. And so I think maybe it would be, at least we could help do the work, where I think that the three of us are connected enough within the community to be able to start to do some of those further asks, and just to see, where are we within the community, since there's not a specific staff member that specializes in that particular area to ask and do some data gathering. And so I would just feel absolutely terrible if after all of this, folks, if the unemployment rate continues to be high, and if and when the second wave comes, that people go back out of work, that we didn't do enough to help individuals who are hurting, besides just the business community. So.
Okay, thank you, Councilmember Fulch. Councilmember Lund.
Yeah, for the record, it's Brox, Lund, and Fulch on that.
Administrative. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry, dear.
No, I don't really care. I'm just, yeah, I would be happy to meet and talk about it. I think that that particular element can get kind of tricky. As you could see, that might be a very tough one to navigate through when it comes down to actually awarding that, especially if there's this audit, the stringent audit process that might be involved. But if we do identify maybe the larger buckets within that, and not get it so granular, I think that would be a good way to go about it when we do meet. And then that money can maybe be earmarked, and then we can get more surgical with it later. But I think sticking with some of the larger ticket items that have already been brought up and that staff will bring forward to us is going to help us get a big chunk of that 1.7 as well. But point is, I'm happy to meet.
Okay, thank you, Councilmember Lund. Councilmember Fulch.
Thank you. I think the three of us concurred that we would at least begin a conversation, and we could do some outreach. I would be happy to connect with the Y and ask what their increases have been. And so maybe we could take this offline and figure out how it is that we can talk to individuals within the community who who are actually servicing folks.
Okay, thank you to the three of you. All right, Dan, you have that direction. And now we'll have on the COVID-19 Financial.
Thanks. I think this conversation will be quicker. A couple of weeks ago or a couple of meetings ago, Finance Manager Melanie Lammers had provided a similar memo about through the end of April. And there's a lag in terms of processing financial information. Obviously, some things that might be purchased by credit card lends itself to a longer lag. But this is an update through the end of May. I think the 2 points that I would highlight in this is that we are seeing, although doing our best to manage with it, we are seeing some revenue loss in operations as well as added expenses in our operations. Certainly not to the extent that some of our businesses have been shut down, but closing down some of our operations, particularly Parks and Rec, means less revenue on those ends. And responding to COVID has given us some expenses that we might not have otherwise had. So we are seeing that general trend in our operations. The other piece I would point out is Melanie notes that a potential major revenue loss that's not reflected in this through the end of May report is second half property taxes. Although the May property taxes came in very strong, and then I was surprised at how well and how quick they came in. We don't know what to expect come October. Will we see the same strong 100% payment, or as the struggles in the economy wear on a bit further, do we start to see some delinquency showing up latter part of this year? So otherwise, unless there's some specific questions about what she outlines, I think it's really just informational for you.
No questions, Council? Okay, thank you, Dan. Council, do you have any announcements, please? Councilmember Fulch?
Thank you, Your Honor. I just wanted to give a quick update. The Utilities Committee, we met a month or so ago. It was Councilmember Lund, myself, and Councilmember Balsonic, and we had a conversation about possibilities of perhaps laying fiber within Highway 316 as we're moving ahead next year. I'm sorry, I should rephrase that. We talked about fiber, but we talked about maybe the possibility of just laying the conduit, just the shell that you would put down to run fiber through eventually, just so that was perhaps a possibility into the future. And so I had mentioned to them during our conversation that I sit on the governor's CAV task force, which is connected autonomous vehicles. And so I was able to make arrangements for a Zoom meeting, an online meeting, and where we had MnDOT actually, so the CAV office is housed within the Minnesota Department of Transportation. And so we had a video conference with some of the representatives of that office. And then Nick Egger, our Public Works Director, and Dan, and also Kara Koch, who is with the Dakota Broadband Board. She's the president of, or she's the director over that. We had a really good conversation, and just to sum it up is that they said that they wouldn't be able to incorporate laying conduit for fiber in the 316 project. It's just too short of a time frame, and the planning of the design is too far along to be able to make that accommodation. And so they're going to actually use Hastings as the poster child for how we lost out on this opportunity as Highway 316 was open to be able to lay fiber conduit there. So the MnDOT is going to begin to make it a part of their normal operations as they're looking at doing a major reconstruction project like this, that they also do some scoping for laying fiber, because MnDOT has a statewide plan where they want to start laying fiber everywhere on their highways. And so the bad news is that we can't do 316. I guess we get it, like I said, we get to be the poster child with what if there had been funds made available and that we had done this in with enough time as to, what it is that we're losing out on, because the majority of the cost when you're doing fiber infrastructure like that is when the roadway is opened up. Like, that's the most expensive part, is digging up the ground and then laying the fiber. That's the cheap part. And so what we lost out on, and they're going to use that as a case for, as MnDOT goes forward and asks the legislature for appropriations for the future so that we can help other governments do this. And so the good news is that hopefully MnDOT, this will be a part of their regular operations. And so when we look at Highway 61 in 2026, that we'll have that as an opportunity to perhaps include that within the scope of that project. And so that's it. That's what I had for now. Thanks.
Yep, sure. Our first free event of the season at Levy Park is Music in the Park with the Brothers Almanac, performing rock music on Thursday, July 9th, 7 p.m. to 8:30. Dine at a local restaurant or come down for the show after dinner. The Brothers Almanac delivers a premier Midwest-rooted tribute to the Allman Brothers Band, playing classics and deep cuts that span the entirety of their storied career. The defined event space has a current limit of 250 people. Music in the Park is supported by Ruth and George Doffing Charitable Fund. All ages are welcome to this free event. Next week, Music in the Park continues with West Wind Swing Band on Thursday, July 16th, 7 to 8:30. The band focuses on music from 1920s to 1940, playing a combination of swing music, Dixieland, and jazz tunes popularized by iconic bands like Glenn Miller, Benny Goodman, Duke Ellington, and of course, Artie Shaw. The event space has a current limit of 250. Story Walk features Once Upon a Reader this weekend, Friday, July 10th to Monday the 13th. Storyboards will be set up along the Hastings River Walk from Levy Park to J.C. Park. The round trip is about 1 mile. Be mindful of social distancing while utilizing the trail. There will be an open house update on the Lake Isabel Park Master Plan on Thursday, July 16th from 4 to 6 at Lake Isabel Park. Coming forward are Thursday, July 9th, 6 p.m. Hedra, Monday, July 13th, 7 p.m. Planning Commission, Tuesday, July 14th, the Parks and Recs Commission meeting has been canceled. Thursday, July 16th, Public Safety Advisory Commission at 6:30 p.m. Monday, July 20th, 5:30 City Council. We have a closed session to meet with attorney about a litigation, and 7 p.m. City Council regular meeting. I would look for a motion to adjourn the meeting tonight. Member Vaughn, Councilmember Fulch, Member Brox, you can be third. Clerk Henderson, would you please call the roll?
Councilmember Vaughn. Yes, okay. Councilmember Fulch.
Yes.
Councilmember Balsonic.
Aye.
Councilmember Liefeld.
Yes.
Councilmember Lund.
Yes.
Councilmember Brox.
But the mayor forgot to mention Mark's birthday, so I just want to make sure you do that.
Oh, Happy birthday, Councilmember Vaughn.
Thanks. It's almost over here.
Well, we didn't miss it. Thank you, Councilmember Brox.
and Mayor Fassbender.
Yes. Motion prevails. Have a good evening, all. Cool.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you.